because there were so many different interpretations. And some even say that there are about 500 different interpretations of what they call the gospel. And therefore they had to make a kind of ijma among their ulama. They had to make to determine consensus, what they consider to be the real interpretation, the true one, the orthodox one, the Catholic one. Catholic means orthodox. And this is how Catholicism has come gradually into existence. It is only sometime in the 7th century, they say. In other words, there was no great changes happening in the West, except what was in the Roman Empire. But you know, the Roman Empire was overthrown, or rather overcome by the Huns, the Germanic peoples, who came down into the empire and destroyed already what was a weakening, corrupt. The emperors were corrupt, and therefore they were easily overcome by the Huns and the German tribes. But the German tribes themselves did not have a high culture. They could not bring anything superior to what the Romans had. Therefore, they were themselves converted to the Roman way of life. Except they brought about the idea of their national traditions, their national identity, the Celtic, Teutonic, Nordic peoples. They have more or less, from their mythology, we can see that they more or less have some similarity in their worldview, the way how they understood the reality around them. It was only after the rise of Islam that gradually they became acquainted again with the Greek philosophers, the ancient, with Aristotle and Plato, and another person called Plotinus, and several others. And because of that, gradually they begin to include into Christianity these ideas from the philosophers and from the Roman, from the Greeks, the ideas about the soul, about education, about government. Because, as I said 2 weeks ago, the Bible, the Gospels, and even the Jewish interpretation of their sacred scriptures did not so mention much about the soul, about spiritual matters. Yes. So in other words, there's nothing very much there about discussion on the soul, on the nature of man. Whereas, as I said 2 weeks ago, the Quran mentions this. The Quran talks about everything having to do with our life here, about the creation. Now, the Jewish scriptures did mention something about the creation, Genesis, which is part of the Bible, but it did not explain many things about God, yes, about the soul, about how this creation has come into existence. How does He create? and who is he, as it were. But the Quran mentions these things. The Quran talks about this universe, about science, about knowledge, about the soul, about government, about justice, about virtues, about ethics. All that is very clear in the Quran. Now, there was a time when the Muslims, when they also, because the discovery of the Greeks, mainly the Muslims, which they later on passed to the West. But when the Muslims also discovered the Greeks, some of them were very much impressed by the intelligence, by the intelligence of the Greeks, and how they interpret things, how they employed their minds, their brains, their intellect to the understanding of this world and life, of nature. One of the earliest philosophers among the Muslims, Al-Kindi, he also talks about the intellect. And there must be some influence also from Aristotle, but at least it's very interesting what he said, which is not known very much because it's not published. There was a letter that he wrote to the Caliph Al-Ma'mun in which he said that the Greeks, they were right in some of their views, but it is not complete, and there are some things that are in error, and therefore he said it is up to us to complete it and to correct the errors. Now it shows that the early Muslim philosophers, at least the thinkers, they acknowledge this, the Greeks, but at the same time they also realize there are some things not complete. The Greeks, of course, talked about these things, I think because they must have been influenced by the followers of the prophet Musa, who lived in Athens in ancient days, some of them. In other words, there were some Bani Israel who had settled there. Otherwise, how do you think they talk about God? How can they talk? How can Aristotle talk about one God? Because he is a pagan. He does not worship one God. He believes in the gods of the Greeks. And yet in his writings he talks about one God. And he tries to interpret the nature of the oneness. So my understanding is that they have got these ideas from the Bani Israel, from the correct interpretation about the teachings of the Prophet Musa, who was floating about, as it were, in the air. Yes. Otherwise, they are using their reason. They realize that they cannot be more than one. And yet, very interesting, isn't it, that these philosophers, when talking about God, one God and so on, Aristotle, but they never practice. They can't, they don't know. The idea of ethics is only political. It's only about government, about how to behave in the government, how to behave as citizens, how to behave in a society of men. So now, this is clear because they did not receive revelation. The revelation comes to the ancient civilization in the Middle East. Yes. I said last year, I think, in another lecture room, I did say there that civilization seemed to have begun in the Middle East, in Egypt, and what they call Mesopotamia, that is today modern Iraq, and in Syria, and because all these ancient excavations reveal the Egyptian way of life, their pyramid, their tombs, and so on, and also the Babylonians. Babylonians are also from Mesopotamia, from that between the river Tigris and Euphrates, and then the Assyrians, today of course Syria, and then you have the Sumerian before that too, who invented this writing, because some of the Egyptians before they used hieroglyphs, picture words. But this Hammurabi, about 7,000 years, they started making symbols, what they call cuneiform script, in order to communicate, to explain, to write about history, about their civilization, about poetry, about religion, about history. And this is how we know about what goes on. As far as the studies of the archaeologists are concerned, I understand that the most ancient, of course, are these. Other civilizations like the Chinese and the Indian and even the Persian, they came later. If we say that the Middle East, the Egypt, Mesopotamia, Babylonia, Assyria, these are the early ones. The Persian, I think, is later, slightly later, not much later, but later. Because we learn about their religion, about that Zoroaster. Yes, this was all after the time of the Prophet Ibrahim. Yes, that means it is later. Prophet Ibrahim, perhaps more than 4,000 years ago. And the Chinese civilization and the Indian, they also say around 5,000 years ago. There is the Indian civilization. Now they discover recently in the last century a kind of a city called Mohenjo-daro, which they consider to be very ancient. But even that, it is not, it doesn't go back to earlier than what those early civilizations of the Middle East. It is interesting that this is so because the prophets, as far as we know, reported in the Holy Quran, in the Bible, in the Old Testament also, they all seem to be coming from that region. And perhaps the fact that civilization began in that part of the world, therefore I come to the conclusion that I think religion is the basis of civilization. It is religion that is that causes the rise of civilization, not because of agriculture not the domestication of animals. These are things that come, that these ideas of the anthropologists of the later, more, only about 200, 300 years ago. But what we say is it is religion that causes the rise of civilization. And then if you look at the other civilizations also, you find that there is a great deal of religion in their temples. When they unearth things, it's always temples. And so we must not relegate religion into the background as if discovery of agriculture by this ancient man, that is the thing that causes the rise of civilization, because by agriculture gradually people come together, they say, and then they domesticate the animals. Yeah, but then it is by religion that people come together. Therefore all these temples, all these ancient, it is that brings people together. Of course, the Holy Quran talks about the fact that God created the animals and so on, certain animals, for us to domesticate, for us to control. God talks about the creation of the sun, the moon, and so on, for our use, to guide us in our travels, the sea, the ships that fly, that sail on the seas. In other words, God, according to the Quran, speaks to the children of Adam that these were created for them, for their use, for their control, and for their rule over it with justice. But then gradually, the way it developed, I said just now that the introduction of Greek thought through Islam to the Christian world, the Western world, I think this has caused great changes there. Their great Imam, that the Saint Thomas Aquinas, he has introduced Aristotle into Christianity, so that some people even talk of Aristotelian Christianity, and then talk about ethics and the soul and what man and so on, following Aristotle mainly. Of course, the Christian element also is emphasized by them. The idea of charity, the idea of love, and then discussions about the nature of God. So in other words, in the medieval, you find very ancient history. The Greeks, and then as far as the West is concerned, the Greeks, the Romans. And then there is a kind of a silence, or not silence, but nothing very much really happened. And then you finally, the rise of Christianity, yes, nothing still also happened until the rise of Islam, because that's when certain things began to be challenged. The Quran and the Muslims, they defeated the Romans. They themselves spread an empire which is very vast compared with the Roman one. The Romans only covering North Africa, certain parts of Europe, but the Muslim, North Africa, and later on Spain and Europe, going up to Russia, going down to India, going down to this part of the world, all within about 150 years after the rise of Islam. So Islam spread very fast. And this, I think, is a big shock for the West. It's like a challenge. They must, in other words, therefore Islam, the rise of Islam has challenged their sovereignty, their hegemony over the world. It also challenged the intellectual, what do you call that, findings. It challenged also the religion. It's not challenge, but it tries to correct. It tries to correct. According to the Holy Quran, even Jesus was sent to the Bani Israel in order to correct, to bring again, to correct whatever has been deviating from the teachings of the Prophet Musa, and to bring what they call glad tidings. The glad tidings that Jesus was bringing, according to our interpretation, mine at least, based on the Quran, is that Jesus said, "There will come after me the one whose name is Ahmad." And so already the rise of Islam, the coming of we are not thinking of kind of an evolution. We are saying that, if I may speak as a Muslim, even in theological terms, that God has planned it in that way, that gradually, and according to stages, because the religion, the nature of God, the Tawhid, cannot just be understood by man that have not been properly, as it were, educated. And therefore, stage by stage, He sends the prophets to their own people. He sent the prophet Noah in the Quran to his own people. He sent the prophet Musa also to the Bani Israel. He sent the other prophets also towards the Bani Israel mainly. He sent some of the prophets to their people. The prophet Yunus was sent, and he sent a Syrian to his own people. The prophet Isa, that is Jesus, was also sent to his own people. That's what he said in the Quran. He said, "Ya Bani Israel, inni Rasulullah ilaykum." You see? But the Prophet Muhammad, whom he already predicted, prophesied would come, he was sent not to his own people, but to mankind as a whole. Always the Quran refers, "Ya ayyuhalladina amanu," that covers everyone. He did not say, "Ya ayyuhal Arab." No, do the Arabs claim themselves to be Bani Ismail? In other words, they were not, although they know their identity as Arabs, their identity is based on genealogy, not on ethnicity. On genealogy. The same with the Jews. Also originally it's like that. But they have gradually made it into something ethnic, something peculiar only to them. So, these challenges, or rather the rise of Islam and so on, I think is something very traumatic that happened to Western man in their experience and consciousness. In fact, I remember saying that the idea of Europe was also not something ancient, which is the way how now today people write in the history books, as if Europe has been all the time existing. This, I think, is not true. Even at the time of the First Crusade, the Pope Urban, who encouraged this crusade, in his speech, he was referring to the Franks. He said, you are fighting each other. You are separated into different tribes. You are, in other words, let us unite to fight our common enemy. And so the Franks. That there was no Europe. Nobody talked about Europe then. They were Franks. And the Muslims themselves also. The ones whom they meet were Franks. The ones who faced them and confronted them were the Franks. And that's why they call them Taranji. Even here also, the arrival of the Portuguese here, the Malays themselves call Peringgi. Peringgi is Taranji, Frank. What I'm trying to say is there was no idea of Europe. This came later, I think. This is also because of Islam, really, which made them gradually unite. Many of their leaders tried to create a Europe. There was Bismarck, no, before Bismarck there was Napoleon. Napoleon tried to he conquered many places in Europe, tried to put, but then he did not succeed. Hitler tried to do the same. He conquered many places, all of Europe more or less, to try to create a Europa. But look at how they have created the name Europe. They took it, of course, from the name of some ancient goddess, Europa, so that it gives to us the impression that this Europe has been existing since ancient times. So in other words, even in Arabic, the idea of Europa is something new. It did not use, no Arab spoke and used that before. In the earlier period, it's recent. In other words, now of course they are trying to unite. Gradually, I think, you remember how their history, I said somewhere, I said that in their case, they look at history, they talk about the classical period of their history, by which they mean the Greek, Roman. And then suddenly there is a kind of a blank, and then medieval. Medieval, that's all after Islam. And then modern. You have classical, you have medieval, you have modern, the period of history. Some of them now are even talking about postmodern. Whatever it is. But between the medieval and the modern, they have the Renaissance, and then they have the Enlightenment. You see, the Renaissance means to be born again. To be born again. So it means that in their experience and consciousness, they felt as if they are now new. They are born again. They are trying to rediscover the ancient, the classical. And then Enlightenment. And comes the idea where the philosophers of the West, these are the ones who gradually develop this conception of man, gradually from them, the way they understand. Originally the Greeks were talking about the soul, Plato talked about soul. Aristotle talked about soul. Later, especially in the time of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, he said that man is not soul. And because of that, this psychology, which is what the Greeks have to the term that has been created by the Greeks, psychology, the science of the soul, he said it should be changed to anthropology, the science of man. So man is not psyche, it is the anthropos. Yes? So gradually how you can see the conception, gradually the soul part suppressed. And then after this enlightenment also, during this period, gradually they begin to study man as this man of flesh and blood, as animal. And therefore, when they define man as rational, they try to interpret rational to mean is the mind, how he tries to understand nature, how he can associate similars, associate them and connect the meaning. So they are trying to interpret this idea of rational to mean the use of the mind, of what they call reason. And reason, they say, is for the purpose of understanding, for the purpose of, what you call this, discovering association of similars by analogy. And gradually, by the time of the few 200 years earlier, or 100 and more years earlier, not 200, 100 years earlier, you have people like psychologists. There is William James. And then there is people like Freud, Sigmund Freud, who begin to talk about psychoanalysis. So already there, the word psycho, the soul, is no longer something spiritual. It is rather something having to do with the physical, with what they call consciousness. And therefore, psychoanalysis is the study not of the soul, according to Freud, it is the study of the actions that have come out of man, how man acts, how he understands, what happened to him. Therefore, it goes back to that. Gradually, even the psychology has become what I call secularized. And so these ideas, gradually, I think this question of the soul, although I'm sure not all of Western thinkers, philosophers and so on, not all of them agree with everything as other people say, but I think it is this group of philosophers. Already you have Auguste Comte, who talked about how originally the man, the way how they want to understand the world, understand the reality about them, they turn to magic. Magic is the way how things are explained according to him. And then later on he said, according to the evolution, gradually religion takes over magic. And then after religion, he said, science will take over. So you see, already long before Darwin, they already are talking about something like evolution, isn't it? That they think they are undergoing an evolutionary process. It is their experience and consciousness. They are the ones who experience that. They are the ones who experience enlightenment, who experience Renaissance. Yes. This understanding or experience of history is not what the Muslims and Islam experience. It is their experience. And now their experience have impinged, have surreptitiously infuse themselves into our experience. And that is why we are confused. Confused, meaning fused together. Confused, that's what it means. The fusion of something which is actually contradictory. So in other words, what Darwin is saying, he brought a lot of scientific details, talking about the origin of species. But as what I'm trying to show is that this idea of evolution was with them from before, although not as not given scientific interpretation as Darwin did, based on his study of the species. And therefore they disagree among themselves. Those who agree with Darwin will say that we are all undergo an evolution from animals, from ape-like creatures, and our difference with the animals, with all animals, is just a matter of degree. But some of the Western philosophers themselves are saying it's not just a matter of degree. It is also different in kind. In other words, that man is not the same as animals. That's what they are saying to say. Man is not descended from the animals. Or at least, man is not evolved from the animals. Because the animals cannot conceive, cannot put ideas together into a grand conception in the interpretation of nature, cannot understand the meaning of beauty, cannot relate, associate similars and into knowledge. Whereas it is man who makes, for example, by looking at things, they look at nature, they compare certain similars, and then gradually they say, these are, that is that animal. Meaning, because they see that animal, what are the characteristics, and then they say, well, the animal, it has got life, it has got nutrition, it has got generation, it has got movement, perception, and these animals. And then comparing with other things, this, they say, is vegetal, plants, and so on. Although they also have nutrition, they have generation, they also produce other plants, yes. But then they cannot move, they don't have voluntary movement, they don't have will, voluntary movement, they cannot see, they don't perceive as far as we know. So that this is classified, this is plants. So from there you can see how the development in the mind of the idea of species, of genus, of difference, of definition, of logic, all these kind of things have come because of this. And that is why the early definition by the Greeks, by Aristotle in particular, is that man is a rational animal. Now, of course, the word animal, the anima, is left in use also. But actually it does not mean animal in the sense of binasa. It means animal as a soul, as far as the Greek is concerned. Yes? And the animals. Now, because this word rational animal, it's the word rational that has to be explained. And in their history, that's it. Because the explanation gradually began to suffer what I would call the loss of the original integrity. Gradually the soul is got rid from that definition. Gradually rational becomes only just what the mind is, the biological man, the mind, the neuro, the brain. Gradually it goes down to that. Now if you compare that with the Muslim philosophers and the thinkers, the theologians also. By Muslim thinkers I mean the philosophers, the Sufis, the theologians, and including the fuqaha, the jurists. They all, yes, man, it's a rational animal, but then their definition is al-insan, hayawan, natik. Now, what it means is that man is a living being, hayawan, living being, natik, that speaks. So in other words, they have defined rationality based on a certain idea of a power in man that was given originally by God when He created man, a power to understand communication, a power to communicate, a power to formulate words in meaningful pattern. Yes, a power to sort of make symbols and sounds representing the symbols. That is the power of language. So that means, I think, based on the Quran, of course, that the definition of man is the fact that he has language. That is what makes him different from the animals. Rationality is nothing but the intellect and the reason and all that becoming audible by sound, becoming seen by symbols. That is what it is. So in other words, what we are saying is that it is this language that makes man different from the animals. Not the language as such, but the very concept of that language. The very concept of language, the power to formulate meaning. And as I understand from my perusal of the Holy Quran, that this is originally given at the time when the souls were made to witness unto themselves who God is. The Quran said, Alastu bi rabbikum. God asked the souls, am I not your God? The soul answered, Bala shahidna. We do accept. The fact that the soul can answer, that's also a gift from God, obviously. But that shows that they understood the meaning. They understood what God is saying to them. And they can answer. So in other words, the idea of this power, this language, was already given to the soul. It is not really the body that creates all these things. Later on, of course, the tongue and so on like that, they created in this way precisely to educate, to what you call it, allocute the right words, the right sounds, which have got meaning. this is, the animals do not have this. Although they might shout and say things which they do understand each other, but of course they cannot do. It's very interesting also how those symbols become sounds. It must have been a very great intellectual step. The Egyptians, ancient Egyptians, they use symbols. But how does it become sound? So in other words, some of the Western philosophers only reason. They are the ones who are now also agreeing with us really by saying that language is the root of what makes man rational. Because it is language that puts things, that conceives ideas. How can you conceive idea if you don't have words, if you don't have language? Yes. How can you relate this and that without language? So in other words, at least some of them do accept that. We have to understand this because I think 2 weeks ago I was talking about how important language is, and long before that I was also talking about how when we talk about the concept of nation, we are saying that, at least I'm saying that it is language. As far as we are concerned, in our context, it is language that can be the basis of what you call Malaysian nation. But that being the case, because Malaysia is composed of different peoples, different religions, different languages, different races, and therefore not the same worldview. Therefore, how can there be what you call a nation from that? How can there arise among all these people of different, a sentiment of solidarity, of unity, of oneness? That is the problem that I was talking about after the independence, 1957. Yes. And we say that can only, as far as our situation is concerned here in Malaysia, this can only be if you have language as the basis of the nation. Because you can't use religion, you can't use race, you can't use history. Because history is something you create yourself. It will take hundreds of years, even thousands of years to create culture. Ibn Khaldun said at least 100 years for culture to be transmitted. Yes. And that also based on education. You have to plan in such a way that it will be agreeable to everyone. So it's not a simple matter, isn't it? We are faced with a very great problem. And because of that, it is not right for us to start forgetting religion. It is not correct for some of our early leaders saying that peace is the highest value. I think Tengku Abdul Rahman was at that time. But I thought that truth is higher than peace. And in fact, it is one of Allah's names. Yes. So in other words, you can't have peace if there is no truth. So in other words, what I'm afraid, you cannot sort of